Welcome everyone to Brookline Booksmith's author event series. My name is Silas Weiner and I'm a member of the events team here at Brookline Booksmith. If you're familiar with our store, welcome back. If this is your first time joining us, welcome. A few housekeeping notes: please keep your phones on silent. If you haven't picked up a pre-ordered book or you would want to buy a book, you can do so after the event, right in the back. There will be time for a Q&A, so get your questions ready. We are here tonight to celebrate the release of Long Gone, and it's my pleasure to introduce the author, Joanna Schaffhausen. Joanna is an award-winning crime and mystery author with a doctorate in psychology, which reflects her long-standing interest in the brain, how it develops, and the many ways in which it can go wrong. Which sounds pretty scary to me. And I have it on good authority that she falls asleep to forensic files. That's how legit she is about this stuff. Her past books include The Vanishing Season, No Mercy, All the Best Lies, Every Waking Hour, and Gone for Good. And previously, she worked for ABC News, writing for programs such as World News Tonight, Good Morning America, and 2020. Welcome, Joanna.
Thank you.
Tonight, the story continues. The next installment of Joanna's critically acclaimed detective Annalisa Vega series is here, and it's titled Long Gone. Chicago detective Annalisa Vega shattered her life, personally and professionally, when she turned in her ex-cop father for his role in a murder. Her family can't forgive her. Her fellow officers no longer trust her. So when Detective Leo Hammond turns up dead in a bizarre murder, Annalisa thinks she has nothing to lose by investigating whatever secrets he hid behind the thin blue line. Annalisa quickly zeroes in on someone who had good reason to want Hammond dead, a wealthy, fast-talking car salesman who's gotten away with murder once and wasn't about to let Hammond take a second shot. Mo Brooks remains the number one suspect in his girlfriend's brutal, unsolved death, and now he's got a new woman in his sights, Annalisa's best friend. Annalisa is desperate to protect her friend and force Brooks to pay, either for Hammond's death or his earlier crime. But when no one else believes the connection, she takes increasingly risky chances to reveal the truth. Because both Hammond and Brooks have secrets to die for, and if she doesn't untangle them soon, Annalisa will be next. Here to tell us more, Joanna.
Thank you.
Yeah.
So wonderful to see all these faces. I'm not in my dining room by myself, which is how I have done the last 3 books. So this is my 7th book, and the last in-person launch I did was book 3. So that's like half my career has been me in my dining room. So it's so great to be back here at the Booksmith, which has been so supportive of me and my books for years now. And I see many familiar faces and some new faces too, which is always very exciting. So thank you so much for giving up your evening and coming out here to listen to me prattle on about my books. Silas mentioned Forensic Files, so I'll start with a funny Forensic Files story. Which is true. I do fall asleep pretty much every night to Forensic Files. I like them because I have them memorized, so if I fall asleep, I don't even have to look at the television. I can just have my eyes closed and listen and know what's happening on the screen. But there's one episode, my husband is lying next to me, and we were watching one night, and it was about a wannabe mystery author who had maybe murdered her husband. And the cops were suspicious when they showed up at the scene and he's dead, and they look at her bookshelves and they're all about like Murder 101, How to Get Away with Murder, Forensics for the Layperson, Hunting Humans, like all these titles. And so the camera's panning across all of her books, and my husband goes, "You have every one of those!" And it's true, I do. But what Forensic Files tells me is that if anything happens to him, I will in fact be the number one suspect based on my Google searches and my books on my shelves. So about Long Gone, which is the book of the evening, some books are really easy. Like you write them and they just like practically write themselves. Other books are harder. This was in the harder category, and I will tell you a little bit about why. So it's the second book. The first book is actually just out in paperback. It's gone for good, and this is the first Annalisa book. And this book was really easy. I wrote it when I was in the middle of trying to write a hard book. I would write 25,000 words in this other book and get stuck. It wasn't working. So I would start over and I'd write a different 25,000 words and get stuck, and it wasn't working. So I started it a third time. So I had yet another 25,000 words that weren't working. And then one day I thought, what if there was an amateur sleuth who's part of like an online sleuth group who sets out to look for a cold case serial killer, somebody who killed a bunch of people years ago and then disappeared. And what if she finds him? And I didn't do any research, I just started writing. And I wrote like 1,000 words a day for 90 days, and then I had this book. And like I started it in May, I sold it in September, like it was so easy. But a funny thing happened. So when I wrote this book, as Silas mentions, at the end, Annalisa makes a decision that blows up her entire life. It changes every relationship she has, from her family to her fellow cops to her boyfriend. Like everything is blown to pieces. She makes a very hard choice. And so this means that's where this second book has to pick up off, you know. And so when my publisher said, we love this book, we want to publish it, I said, yay! And they said, we love it so much, we want to make it a series. And I said, yay! Like, a series, who doesn't want more books, right? But I said, I'm going to have to spoil the ending of this book in the subsequent book. And they're like, what do you mean? And I said, well, she makes this terrible decision that has all these ramifications. So like that's what people are going to want to read about, right? Like that's where the character picks up in her next adventure. And they're like, oh yeah, well that'll be fine, you know, it'll be fine, and we can find a way around that. I'm sure it'll be good. So then I wrote it, and I sent it in, and now all the industry people, my agent and my editors are looking, and they're going, oh yeah, we see what you mean, like you have to give away the ending. And so there was like brainstorming about, could we fix it? And they're like, what if we move her to a different city? And I'd already moved her from Boston to Chicago. And they're like, well, then she would be the only holdover character, and she would still know in her head that she had shattered all these relationships. So they were like, what if we gave her amnesia? And I'm like, that would be an interesting twist, but again, I think people are going to be interested to figure out, like, how does she pick up the pieces of her life after making this this terrible decision that had all these ramifications. So that is what, and they're like, okay, yes, and we all eventually agreed that this is the book, it works, but you absolutely do have to start with the first one. Most of my books aren't like that. You can drop in and out. This one, you really do have to start with the first one. But it's now on paperback, so you can get it cheaper. Yay! So now Annalisa has these problems, right? Like how to fix her life, and what should she be doing as her second adventure? What kind? So she was chasing a serial killer in the first book. So now, what kind of case is she going to tackle in the second book? And I promised online to reveal the X-Files connection here. Some people in the room know I got my start writing X-Files fan fiction, and I'm a big X-File fan. And one of my favorite episodes is Jose Chung's From Outer Space, which is very fun and is kind of a meditation on what truth is, because it's told from different points of view, and the same events keep happening from different points of view, and you can see how one person's truth is not necessarily the other person's truth. But there also is a funny moment where they have Jesse the Body Ventura, the wrestler, and Alex Trebek playing Men in Black. So the Men in Black are people who show up in legend when there has been some sort of weird like UFO sighting. Kind of like Will Smith and Tommy Lee Jones and the Men in Black. It's the same thing. It's a legend. It's part of the sighting that the Men in Black come and they convince you that you didn't see what you thought you saw. And so one of the lines in the book is that in the episode is that the Men in Black will deliberately act strange so that when you try to say what happened, you sound like an idiot. Like, oh yeah, it was Alex Trebek and Jesse the Body Ventura came and told me that I didn't see a UFO. I only saw the planet Venus. And like, you sound like a mad person, right? So of course you didn't see a UFO, just like you didn't see Alex Trebek. And I thought, well, this is sort of interesting, this idea that a crime is so crazy or preposterous on the face of it that the people who are involved, when they try to tell you about it, they sound like they're crazy. And then also, I was interested in a case that kind of fell along these lines. The true story of a case out in Viejo, California in 2015. And this man named Aaron Quinn and his girlfriend, Denise Huskins, were kind of having a rough patch. Aaron had been engaged previously to another woman, and he was not very trusting, and like he was kind of a little iffy on the relationship. And then Denise caught him texting this ex-fiance behind her back, and she's like, are we having a relationship or aren't we? And they were a little bit on and off for a few weeks, and then one night in March, Denise came over to Aaron's house. They sat down, they hashed it out, and they decided, yes, we're going to go for it. We're going to be a couple. We're going to make a fresh start. And they went to bed. And here's where it gets weird. So, according to Aaron, they were woken up like 2, 3 in the morning by a man dressed in a diving suit and like goggles and everything. And he tied them up, and he put goggles with duct tape over them on their eyes, and he kept talking about how he was we were forced to carry out this operation. And at one point he suggested maybe he wanted the fiance, or there was some target of this military operation. He forced them to drink cold medication, lots of cold medication, so they were woozy. And then he took down Aaron's cell phone information and email, and told him, like, in the morning you're going to call in sick. I'm taking Denise with me, and you're going to have some tasks to do, and if you do them, I'll return Denise in 2 days, and if you don't do them, Denise. So he made, like, this frogman made off with Denise in the middle of the night, at which point Aaron passed out from the cold medicine, which if you've ever, OD'd on NyQuil, you can understand. And he woke up in a few hours and was like, oh God, yeah, calling in sick. So he called in sick and then promptly passed out again. Then he woke up a few hours later, and now he's in a panic. Where's Denise? And he checks his phone, and he has a message from the kidnapper saying, go to the bank, 2 different banks, withdraw $8,500, or Denise gets it, kind of stuff. And don't call the police, right? Like, as they always say, don't call the police. So he texts back and gets no answer. So he starts panicking. And it turns out Aaron has an older brother named Ethan, who is an FBI agent. So Aaron calls up his brother and is like, hey, Frogman took my girlfriend, what should I do? And the brother's like, you should call the cops. So Aaron calls 911, and the cops show up, and they look around the apartment, and they see it's kind of in a little disarray, and this guy they're like, are you on drugs? What the frogman? What are you talking about? And he's like, well, I am on drugs. Yes, I'm on the cold medicine, because he made us take it. And they're like, sure he did. A frogman came in and took your girlfriend. I'm sure that's exactly what happened. So they, of course, haul Aaron down to the station and grill him, because they're now thinking he did something to Denise, and then he's made up this frogman story. And he's like, no, it was a frogman. So now they're going through his apartment. They don't find any evidence of a frogman. They do find a little blood stain on the sheets, and now they're more convinced than ever that he did something to Denise. So they're like, we don't believe these lies about a frogman. What happened to your girlfriend? Where is she? And this goes on for a day or so, at which point the kidnapper supposedly sends a message to the San Francisco Chronicle, a recording of Denise, saying, I've been kidnapped, and something like there's a recent event with a plane crash to indicate this is a current message. I need, $8,500 or whatever to be released. And the cops still aren't convinced. They're like, okay, maybe they're in on it together. This is some sort of weird scam. So then the next day, Denise shows up. The kidnapper, according to Denise, dropped her off. And like she had duct tape over her eyes, and he's like, stay here, and then I'll drive away, and then you can take the duct tape off. And he coincidentally left her in her parents' neighborhood. She walked to her parents' house, and then they went to the cops, and the cops are like, oh, we see what this is now. This is Gone Girl. Cops are big mystery readers. And Denise is like, I'm sorry, what? And they're like, so you set up Aaron for your kidnapping. So you faked this whole thing, and you sent the message to the Chronicle, and you pretended to be kidnapped, and it's all to frame Aaron, and it's a revenge because he was texting that other chick, and you were mad. That's what happened. And she's like, no, actually, I was really kidnapped by a frogman. I'm like, sure you were. The frogman again, right? Like a guy in a frog suit? Sure. And they just flat out didn't believe her. And she had to get an attorney, Aaron had to get an attorney, and the police actually had a press conference and said, this is a hoax, there was no kidnapping, the people that should be apologizing are Aaron and Denise for wasting our time. Like, they should reimburse us for the hours we worked on this case. And then, so this was March. In June, funny thing happens. Different town, some miles away, couple's asleep in their bed when a man in a frog suit breaks in, and he tries to tie them up with zip ties, and this husband was not taking it. And so he fought back, and there was a scuffle, and in the scuffle, the frogman dropped his cell phone. Pro tip, if you're gonna do crimes, don't bring your cell phone. This is like a big lesson. Criminals routinely mess this up, and so did Matthew Muller. This was the man's name. It was eventually traced back to him. So Matthew Muller is not what you would think is a regular, like, guy who should be breaking in and committing crimes. He was Harvard educated. He's an ex-Marine. Not somebody you would necessarily, pretty good looking. You wouldn't think he would be the kind of guy that would do this sort of thing, but he did it. And so the cops are searching his house, and they're looking around, and a new detective by the name of Misty Karasku was looking around, and she saw a pair of these goggles that he had put over his victim's face with the duct tape on them so they couldn't see out of the goggles. And there's a long blonde hair attached, just one hair. And in the household where he was caught and dropped his cell phone, nobody had blonde hair. And she's like, this guy has done this before. And she starts thinking, looking around, sees the zip tie, sees the goggles. She remembers the hoax case and is like, I think maybe that case in Viejo is related to my case here in Dublin. And so she called up Viejo, and Viejo was like, nah, that was a hoax. And she's like, maybe send the FBI. So the FBI does in fact show up, and it turns out, yes, they were related. Forensics eventually did connect the two cases. The frogman was real the whole time. And the kicker is that the Viejo police never apologized. They apologized privately, and they said that when Mueller was indicted, they would go and have another press conference and apologize in public for all the things they had said about Aaron and Denise, basically going on TV and calling them liars, and they never did. Aaron and Denise have written a book about it. You can check it out if you want. It's on Amazon. Crazy story, right? But it turned out to be true. So I borrowed just the frogman from this story. So the rest of it has nothing to do with Long Gone. But in this story, Annalisa is called to the scene of a murder of a fellow police officer. And he was gunned down in his own bedroom in the middle of the night, and his much younger trophy wife is unharmed at the scene. And she says a frogman did it. Like, broke into the house, shot her husband, flip-flopped and flippers out again. And the cops are like, sure he did. But of course, the frogman is real and is wreaking havoc throughout the book. So Annalisa has to figure out, like, what's real, what's not, who's lying, and what the heck is this frogman doing? And that's probably the main mystery of Long Gone. And then, of course, there's the fallout from book 1, where she has all kinds of family relationships that she has to repair. Some of the early reviews are like, Annalisa seems angry. And it's like, yes. After what happened in book 1, she's angry. So one of the things this book is about is her kind of seeing what happens when some other character in the book is sort of incandescent with anger and doesn't deal with it well, and realizing maybe she doesn't want to walk that path. So this is, book 2 is sort of Annalisa getting back on the straight and narrow again, as much as she is. She has a tendency to pursue justice at all costs. Yeah, that's the first book, and then the second book, and there's a third one. Yay, there will be more Annalisa. And that one is called Dead and Gone and comes out next year. And let's see, any questions? I've been talking for quite some time. Yes, Edwin.
Was there ever an explanation for the frog suit? Like, why the real guy? Like, why?
Oh,
was
the
he
real
wearing
guy?
a-
Why was he wearing a frog suit?
Yeah.
I don't know that there was ever a full explanation, but it's a good way not to leave DNA. Like, you know, if you're trying not, and he's military, so he would know that. So that's my guess. Any other questions?
Well, I do have another one.
You have another one? Okay.
Like, if we were to go onto your Google search right now, what
Uh-huh.
would be the most incriminating thing we've done?
Google. So Edwin wants to know what's the most incriminating Google search. I mean, I always say, like, I've Googled where to hide a body in Chicago and gotten hits. Like, you can look this information up. So I feel like that is one thing that would probably not look good for me. But I'm also, you know, looking up, like, how soon you get lividity and, you know, like, poison sometimes. You know, like the mystery writer's Google searches, it's not pretty. I did get somebody ask me recently if Annalise is going to keep taking on bad cops. Like, because this is one of the questions about this book. So at the end, you know, she turns in her father for his role in a murder, and he was an ex-cop. And in here, the detective who gets gunned down in his own home turns out to have a lot of secrets of his own, and he has partners who have secrets of their own, etc. And, like, is this Annalisa's role now? Is that she's gonna go after bad cops? So Annalisa, like, thought her father was a hero and joined up with the police with the idea that, you know, she was gonna do good, like he did. And it turns out maybe in some ways he wasn't so good, and some of her fellow officers are great and great cops, and some of them are not. And the thing is that when Annalisa turns in a fellow cop, a lot of her fellow officers are like, you don't do that. Like, you don't turn in family. And they're not pleased with her. So Annalisa already finds herself on the wrong side of the thin blue line. And so when you're already on the wrong side, and, you know, you got a dead cop, it's like, okay, whatever secrets he's got, like, who are we going to get to dig him up? Well, the person who's already been digging around. But no, that's not going to be necessarily a continuing theme of the book, but it is where she is at this stage in her career. She's in the very much to the hell with it, kind of burn it all down sentiment right now.
Where do you hide a body body in Chicago?
Where do I hide a body in Chicago? Why do you need to know, Olivia?
No, but like, what came up when you searched that? What are the results?
Well, what are the
Yes, tell
results?
us, please.
You just Google it yourself, young lady.
No, but what did come up?
Well, I mean, there's different parks, depending. Like, there's places where bodies frequently show up. Like, one of my favorite anecdotes is from Law and Order, back when Law and Order Original Recipe was on, and they were talking. The show, somebody from the show was talking about how they were always pulling bodies out of the East River. And the show was going to stage one where they were pulling a body out of the East River, and the camera crew shows up all ready to film it, and the actual cops were there pulling a body out of the East River. So, there are places that are sort of known as body dumps, and you can go and just add yours to the mix. But I do think if you really want to hide a body, like, go to Alaska. There's a lot of just nowhere up there, where wilderness just goes on and on. So if you're looking to commit murder, Alaska is, I think, a pretty good place to go.
You clearly thought this through a lot.
Well, yeah. There's a whole show devoted to murderers in Alaska, and I always think, well, you're the incompetent ones, right? Because you got caught. If you're getting caught for murder in Alaska, you're definitely not the sharpest tool in the shed. Yes.
So your first series is largely set in Boston, which is
Yep.
somewhere that you've lived most of your life. What's it like writing something that was set somewhere else?
So the question is, the first series is mostly set in Boston, where I live and have lived, and I've never lived in Chicago, where Annalisa lives and is set. And what's that like, writing someplace I don't live? The answer is it's harder. It's a lot harder. It's probably easier than it would have been 20 years ago before Google. Now you can actually just go look around the city on Google Maps and stuff. But when my publisher wanted to move Annalisa, because I wrote Gone for Good originally set in Boston, and they're like, well, we need to differentiate it from your other Ellery series. Where can we move it? And I said, well, I need a city that is big enough to hide a serial murderer, is very neighborhoody, where you can get people who have lived within the same few blocks for generations, and that I have been enough that I have some feel for. So I've visited Chicago a lot. And I have some wonderful beta readers who help me out with Chicago, people who live there or have lived there, who know it much better than I do, who can, point out stuff to me that I've gotten wrong or make suggestions about how to make it more authentic. So it's definitely more challenging. It adds another layer of boy, I'm going to have to make this up too and try to get it right. But it's fun. It's a fun challenge, and I get to go have a reason to go visit Chicago, which is a city I really love. Yes.
So there's a lot in the news these days about good cops and bad cops and decisions cops make, and I'm just kind of wondering, as you were developing Annalisa, were you thinking about kind of her character and sort of what's going on today in the world?
Oh yeah, so this is the question is about good cops, bad cops, cops in the media now. Yeah. So I wrote Gone for Good, actually. It came out last year, but I wrote it in 2018. So there's a big gap between when I conceived of Annalisa and when she actually appeared on the scene. And I've talked to cops, I've read a lot of cop stories. I don't think I was naive about the idea that there's good cops and bad cops, but I definitely feel in the past couple of years I've become more aware of how the system of police makes it really hard for the good cops to necessarily do well. I think the system is frequently corrupt, and so even for the good actors, to succeed, it can be challenging. I still, like, I admire them, a lot of them, like, who, you know, it's your job to run towards danger. They see the worst of humanity day in and day out, the big city cops, and to try to maintain your own humanity in the face of that, I think can be challenging. But when I was writing Long Gone, which I did during 2020, I think, in the face of, you know, the protests, and then also like just gutting headlines here in Boston, where, you know, you'd open the papers and it was like, oh, hey, so it turns out the head of the police union is a wife beater. Or this other cop who was a child molester for years, and other cops knew about it and covered it up, like the whole system, rather than, it's kind of like the Catholics with the priests, you know, rather than dealing with it, they just sort of move him around and hush everything up, and he's allowed to continue like acting, preying on people. And even things like, you know, Aaron and Denise, who the police were very wrong about. And you can sort of understand, like, yes, it's a crazy story with the frog man, and maybe you are like playing the odds there that Aaron did something to Denise and there was never any frogman. But when it turns out you're wrong, like, you should go out there and say that. And they didn't. So, I do a lot of research, and I follow like true crime stories and true cop stories, and some of them are very fun, and they have ended up in the books. One is my favorite, of a woman who called the cops on the cicadas because they were making too much noise. And the cop showed up and he's like, do you want me to get like 1,000 tiny handcuffs? Like, how's that gonna work? And another one where a woman in a preschool called the cops because there was a creepy man staring at her in the window across the street. And the cops show up, and it's a cardboard cutout of Arnold Schwarzenegger. And another one where some guy was out on the street yelling, "Help! Help! Help!" So the cops show up and they're like, "Okay, we're here. What is it you need?" He was looking for his cat, who was named Help. And, you know, stories like this where you just sort of have to laugh, or you're like, oh my goodness, the things they deal with. But, like in Long Gone, darker stuff is also mentioned, where like Leo, the cop who's gunned down in his bedroom and kicks off the story, he has his trophy wife there, but he has an ex-wife too that he, you know, ditched for the trophy wife. And when they were separating, and his wife was trying to take the house and the kids and all this other stuff, he sicked his fellow cops on her. So all of a sudden she's getting pulled over for no reason, and they're busting her taillight, and they're behaving in kind of a threatening manner. This is a true story. This is something that happens sometimes, where cops will have their fellow cops intimidate, especially women, like wives, when they're threatening to like escape. So yeah, I mean, cops are humans, right? So you have both like really amazing examples of stories of like dogged detectives who pursue justice for decades and finally get it, against all odds. And then you have like real creepers also present. And both of them are in here. And Annalise is definitely on the good end. I mean, she's a main character, she's a heroine. She's not perfect, she doesn't make always the smartest choices, but her heart is always in the right place, and she is always justice-minded, and she is sort of increasingly frustrated when she bumps up against officers who maybe don't feel the same. But it's tricky. I have been on a panel called Writing the Police Procedural in, you know, Our Modern Times. And the answer is it's not easy. Yes, any other questions?
Would you ever imagine writing a book about bodies that show up in Lake Mead because of the drought?
Oh, isn't that fascinating? I have been watching that, yeah. So the question is about the bodies that are being revealed in Lake Mead thanks to climate change. Yeah, really fascinating stuff, right? You think, ooh, I got it buried forever, and then nope. Yeah, it turns out climate change is not your friend.
Like Michigan.
Yep, yeah, I mean, I haven't personally thought about writing that story, but that is the kind of thing when I'm thinking about what is going to be my next book, I go looking for these sort of ideas about like what if a body that was buried in Lake Mead is suddenly revealed by a drought to actually be there. I think that's how most crime writers start with like, oh, what if? Well, what if a body showed up here? Or, what if somebody was actually pretending to be somebody else and you didn't know, and then all of a sudden they ripped their mask off and they're like, it was me all along. Yeah, there's lots of really crazy crime stories out there. I think I've mentioned a few times, some of you may have heard this story, one of my weirder ones is Diane Kine's murder. So Diane was strangled to death in her bed in her home, and with her were her adult son and her second husband. One of them killed her. So, like, how many suspects do you need in a story, right? This has 2. One of them definitely did it. And they both call 911, and they both say the other guy did it. And the cops show up to find them, like, fighting with each other on the front lawn. And they're like, eh? And because they both lived in the home with Diane, like, the forensics weren't super helpful. And like this story's got all kinds of weird twists and turns, and I wrote a blog about it, and every time it shows up on Dateline, people go and they search for it online and they get my blog. So now like I had to turn comments off because people were fighting in the blog. But also, like, people related to the case have contacted me. So the 2 suspects are her husband Bill and her son Kevin. And the motives were supposedly Kevin, the son, had a bad temper and didn't get along sometimes with Bill, his stepfather, and sometimes even Diane. And the police had been called because there was yelling and maybe some shoving or some threats, and Diane wanted him to move out. So that was supposedly his motive. And then Bill got the life insurance, and it was a lot. But Bill's nice and charming. Kevin kind of had an attitude and was a grumpy sort of person, and the cops didn't like Kevin. So they decided Kevin did it. And Kevin was put on trial. I think he was convicted, then it was overturned on appeal, and he was released. Spoiler, I'm pretty sure Bill did it, the husband. Because it turns out Bill had a first dead wife. And my general rule of thumb is you get one dead spouse, and then we start looking at you funny. And Bill had already had a dead wife, and it was hinky circumstances. There was again a young woman. Supposedly, she got up in the middle of the night, went out to the pool, fell and hit her head on the concrete and died. And Bill collected a hefty life insurance policy on her too. So, spoiler, thanks to my blog and people who keep tabs on this, I can tell you Bill has a third dead wife. Yeah. Uh-huh. So, anyway, one day, there in my email inbox is Kevin, the son. He's found my blog. And he's like, please help me. And I'm like, oh no, I can't. I'm sorry. I'm just a crime writer. I make up, like, crime. I don't not Angela Lansbury, like I don't go around solving mysteries. I just write about them, which is again a funny thing. Like at my events, sometimes people will come up to me and be like, "So we have an arsonist in our town. Could you look into that? Like, if we got the cops to like give you the files." No, I couldn't. Could not do that. Thanks. That's also fictional. But yeah, so it's just these stories and the ideas come from everywhere. I usually borrow just a few elements. Like one element that shows up in this book that is like just a tiny little bit from a much larger story is a piece of a story about a young man in college who drove several hundred miles in the middle of the night to murder his parents with an axe. Only his mom lived. And the cops, and then he went back to college. The cops have him dead to rights. But one of the things that tipped the cops off, and I thought this was really fascinating, like this one little piece, he took the axe to the home security system. So like it's his house, right? So he uses his code to get into the house. But then he knows that this will show that he used the family code to get in. So he hacks the security system. But it's inside the house. So he had to get in and then hack the security system. And why would you do that? Well, you're trying to hide something about the security system. And unfortunately for Christopher Porco, the information was stored off-site. So hacking the box actually didn't help him, and they were able to know that whoever had done this crime had used the family's code to get into the house. The other thing, not in this book, but that I do find really interesting, just in general, is the mom. I mean, she has terrible injuries, right? But she lived, and I guess right after, she said Chris did it. But by the time she recovered, she's like, he didn't do it. And she stood by him through the whole trial. And all the evidence that the police were able to get on him. They have him in his Jeep leaving campus and coming back, and they have the Jeep going through the tolls on the New York Thruway. He was smart enough not to use the like Easy Pass, but that meant he had to take a ticket, and they have his fingerprints on the ticket. And then the fact that like he told people he was coming into some money, there's a mountain of evidence. It was definitely Chris who did this, and he successfully murdered his father, and he gravely injured his mother, and his mother her psychology won't let her admit that. Like, I saw this on another true crime show recently where the husband had murdered his wife and their 2 small children. And again, tons of evidence, this man definitely did it. And the show was interviewing his parents, so the people who had raised this man, who had gone on to murder his family. And it was really revealing. They were like, whoever did this was a monster. Our son could not be a monster. Ergo, our son did not do it. Like a little syllogism, like the logic. And you're like, you're almost there, but no. But that's how they were thinking. Like, obviously whoever did this is a monster. Our son is not a monster. So no matter how much evidence you have on him, it can't be real. And so this is the stuff I really find interesting in crime writing, is delving into the psychology of the people who do it, the people who are forced to like work the crimes as cops to like figure it out, the victims, the families of the victims, the people who have to live with it. That's why I do this. Yeah.
One more. Did you think about, with all of the cold case files,
Mm-hmm.
they're finding through genealogy, and
Yep.
whatever, that's like a whole new thing. Somebody just today or yesterday, somebody was arrested for murder 40 years ago.
Yeah, I find that stuff really interesting too. And one of those stories makes it into Annalisa 3, so next year. A little bit. It's based on one of those stories. But the question is about genealogy, forensic genealogy, where the people's relatives of their have their DNA in some sort of public database, and that is used to match some sort of criminal's database or DNA. It's caught the Golden State Killer, Joseph DeAngelo, is probably the most public of these cases, but there's actually been a bunch of them now. I find it totally fascinating because you think you've gotten away with it for years, decades even, and then out of nowhere, like, they come with the cops and they snap the cuffs on you. Like, I think the most interesting thing about the Golden State Killer and Joseph DeAngelo is he was a cop, right? And this is one reason they couldn't catch him when he was committing all his crimes in the 70s and 80s. And so DNA became a forensic tool in 1986. That's the first case. That's about where his last murder is. And he'd left DNA everywhere. So he's very careful about stuff cops were using at the time. So hair, DNA, hair, fingerprints, that sort of thing. He always knew he had an exit strategy so he didn't get caught. He knew, the kinds of things that cops were going to be looking for at crime scenes. But he didn't think about DNA because it wasn't a thing to think about when he was doing all these crimes. And then, so he left just tons of it everywhere, which turned out to be his undoing. And the big question, of course, is this man was like a one-man crime spree up and down California for like a decade. And then he just stopped. Cold turkey. And you're like, why? Why did he just stop? And I wonder if it's DNA. That, like, you're like, wait a minute. Maybe I can't be doing this. The other thing is his crimes were very physical. And I sort of wonder if it was more of a young man's game and he maybe didn't have the physical domination anymore. But I wonder if DNA, the one thing he didn't think about, and the fact that he left so much of it, that was really his undoing, because like the minute they had DNA as a tool, they started going after him with DNA. That's the first, like one of the first things in California. They're like, oh, DNA is a tool? Have we got a case for you? And they ran his DNA over and over, like every time there was a new advance with the DNA. So they connected all his crimes with the DNA pretty early in like 1990. And then they just like kept going after him. And every time there was a new suspect, they would run it again. And in other cases, you might run out. Like you use up the DNA so that there wasn't enough to do the forensic genealogy. Not this guy. He left so much of it everywhere that there was still plenty. And they were able to get him. But I always wonder about that. That like he basically shut down right around the time DNA became a crime-solving tool. And he was smart enough and tuned in enough that maybe he knew. But I think it's an amazing tool. Totally fascinating. Yes?
Oh, it's a silly question. Who do you like better, Ellery or Annalisa?
Who do I like better, Ellery or Annalisa? See, it's like asking, what child do you like better? Fortunately, I only have the one child, so this is easy. What about Winston? What about my dog? Yeah. Yes. Yeah, we always joke that Winston's the fur brother and Eleanor is the skin sister. But Ellery versus Annalisa. I mean, I like aspects of them both, obviously. I'd say my heart's probably more with Ellery. From the first series, I have more in common with her. I think we both have a basset hound, you know? But
how did that happen?
How did that happen? Yeah, I got the basset hound after Ellery. She had one first and I was jealous, so I got a basset hound too, so we could be like the same. Twinning, yeah, we're twinning. But you know, they're both really fun to write. And they're different, although like they're kind of meeting in the middle because Ellery was kidnapped by a serial killer when she was 14, so she also pretty angry, and she becomes less so over the course of the series. And then Annalisa is a relatively light character who runs headlong into a serial murder case that ends up blowing up her family, and now she's more angry. So they're meeting in the middle on the anger scale, but they're both fun for different reasons. I like Annalisa's relationship with her ex-husband. I was gonna read like one page near the beginning where they're talking. Let's see. Yeah. So they're gonna go have to canvass a really tall apartment building for witnesses, and Annalise is not excited about it. Residents in this area had long ago learned to keep their eyes to themselves. She eyed the hulking brick building with dread at the idea of climbing all those floors for nothing. What are the odds it has a working elevator? Oh, come on, Vega. Nick gave her one of his easy grins. I know you like working up a sweat with me. You're not allowed to say that stuff anymore, she told him as she started walking toward the building. Since when? He fell into step beside her. Since the ink dried on our divorce papers 14 years ago. Didn't you complete the department's sexual harassment training? Yeah, but it turns out there's a loophole. She stopped walking to look at him. What loophole? If the two parties have seen each other naked in the past 6 weeks, then it's flirting, not harassment. She winced inwardly. New Year's Eve, 4 weeks ago, a champagne headache that felt like it was still wearing off. One night in 14 years does not change the rules, she told him. That's why I'm angling for another. Speaking of, what are you doing later? So yeah, I really like writing Annalisa and Nick. They're fun. Yes?
Will we see Ellery again later on?
Ah, will Ellery return? Who knows? The Phantom knows. Yeah, or the Shadow knows. Okay. It's before my time. Yeah, I don't know. So, you know, like that series ran headlong into the pandemic. And the pandemic was not kind to book sales. But I will say I conceived initially of 5 books, and that's what there are. So it's what I set out to do with those characters, I did, and I think it ends in a really nice place. Could she return? Sure. She's still working as a cop. You know, Reed's still around, Bump's still around. I could get the gang back together. But it's okay where I left them. Okay. Well, thank you so much for coming and for your attention. I'm happy to sign any books.